Hey everybody, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to do a little special episode involving Han Solo, something I like to call Who Shot First. So let's just dive right into it. We're going to take a little bit of time to talk about the caricature, but we're actually going to be focusing more on the color method a little bit later on. So I have sped up the pencil piece of this a little bit, and just to kind of speak to it briefly, just kind of mention here that this is a little bit different of a character than I usually do. And all I really kind of mean by that is I wanted to go with a little bit more looser, cartoonish style than the kind of more portrait versions that I tend to do with caricatures. So I kind of got some inspiration for this one from some of the artists that used to work for like Mad Magazine, if that makes sense. That kind of more, again, cartoony style with a lot of focus on line work. So when we get to the final rendering here, you're going to notice that I'm not going to really make any attempt to color my line work or change anything from that kind of bold black comic book style that, is a little bit comfortable for me, and it was kind of fun to do with this piece. The pose that you're looking at here is something that comes directly from a photograph. We'll look at the reference a little bit later on, and it comes from the cantina scene in the very first or original Star Wars movie from back in the late 70s. Now, this is a scene from the cantina, so the idea is that Han Solo has his kind of leg up, is kind of crossed over the table there. The gun in his hand is kind of my own invention. The idea is that this is supposed to make you remember this piece of the movie where he had the shootout scene with that alien Greedo, and it's kind of a joke on the whole who shot first mentality. Now, if you're not familiar with this kind of goes back to the original screening of Star Wars where Han Solo shot Greedo without any real motivation other than the fact that they were in some sort of a dispute. Now, a little bit later on, several decades later, George Lucas decided to make some changes, and one of the changes that he made was that Greedo, the alien, shot at Han first, and therefore Han acted in self-defense. This caused some sort of an uproar, I guess, in this idea that Han originally did shoot first. And there's some argument about whether or not that's within his character. I honestly don't have a dog in that race one way or the other, but I think it's kind of funny to use the punchline here that Han shot first. And we're going to use this when we get into a little bit of a punchline at the end of this piece, so stay tuned for that. Now, I'm getting into the final line work here. Notice here this line work is going to be very important because it is sticking around, but I'm not going to be coloring over it or trying to hide it later. But notice here that the precision is going to be necessary, so I'm being very precise about the lines that I'm putting in the gun. And I do have a separate kind of reference photo here for Han Solo's gun that I'm using to inform the line work that I'm putting in this, even though it's not part of the original picture that I'm kind of using as my main inspiration here. I wanted to make sure that I got the gun as accurate as I possibly could. As a matter of fact, what you may start noticing here is that some of these lines are overlapping, and it's by means of explanation, and we will get into some detail a little bit later. It's that I'm separating layers on how I'm going to be doing the coloring a little bit later on. So the head line work is on its own layer. The torso line work is on its own layer. Each of the hands are on their own layers, you can kind of see right now, and this little leg that kind of sits in the foreground will also sit on its own layer. This makes the coloring a lot easier. And speaking of coloring, let's go into Procreate and we'll talk about how that's done and come back to the time lapse in a second. Okay, now in Procreate, I pulled up a couple of photo references for us to take a look at, and we're going to be talking today a little bit about the shadows, and a little bit about the coloring rendering too, but mostly we're going to focus a little bit on shadow work. And I wanted to pull this one up because it's a great example of what we're going to be doing in the Han Solo piece. Now, this is a self-portrait of Rembrandt, done roughly around the mid-1600s or so, and what you want to kind of take a look at here is this triangle that exists on his face. This is right here. I'm gonna kind of draw it in for you so make it really obvious. Right there on the cheek, there's a little shadow, or excuse me, a little triangle of light. All right, let me take away that triangle there, and you can get a little closer look at it. Oh, hold on a second, back it out. There you go. You see the little triangle kind of takes up this little shape right there. This is sometimes referred to as the Rembrandt triangle or Rembrandt lighting. It's a specific type of lighting that he used in his portraits. And again, this self-portrait here is a great example of it. And you can see what it does is creates this interesting little kind of combination of light and shadow that falls on the face in such a way that we get this little production of a little, again, triangle right here on one of the cheeks. All right. Now, he did this quite a bit. That's why his name has kind of become synonymous with it. So let's take a look at another example right here. This is another portrait that Rembrandt did. A little bit earlier than the self-portrait that we just took a look at. But if we zoom in on it, it's a little bit more subtle, the triangle. And there we go. We got our nice little triangle right there. Okay. Now, this has kind of become a popular type of lighting and rendering, so we'll see it pop up again in a lot of photography as well. So if you never noticed it before, this is one of those things that you just kind of always see going forward when you look at photographs. Not everything is done like this, but it's a very common type of lighting done to get that little triangle there, sometimes on the opposite side of the face. And again, this is come over into modern painting, modern photography, and you can see it applies to both male and female, sometimes more subtle, sometimes a little more drastic or more pronounced in terms of lighting. But again, we have a triangle right here and then triangle right there, okay? Now, let's take a look at the reference photo that we're using for our little Han Solo project here. And you can see that we also have the Rembrandt triangle. Now, it's a little bit more subtle, but it's there. It exists right here underneath his little eyelid. Let me get the right layer up here. So we have it right here. Again, it's subtle, but it's there. And we're going to use this to kind of inform the shadow rendering that we're going to be doing in the Han Solo piece. Now, I got some requests to talk a little bit about how I do the color rendering and shadow and do a little bit more of an in-depth kind of demonstration on it. So we're going to do that right now. I'm going to show you how I do some coloring here. And we're going to use the line work from our Han Solo face to kind of do this live, all right? So just go ahead and disregard all the layers that I've kind of set up at this point. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go ahead and just kind of combine them all and just get rid of them. We don't really need them anymore. And what I want to do here is I'm going to take my line work, and notice here I have my layer labeled as my line work. I'm going to duplicate it, and I'm going to take the original one and I'm going to lock it so that way I don't accidentally color over it later. I'm going to use the lower layer here, and I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call it color. All right. Now, the reason why is because I'm going to use these lines to help me just get some quick coloring done. So first things first, I'm going to go in and I'm going to pick something of a flesh tone, and I'm going to go ahead and just paint it in. Now, my brush is just a regular old taper brush. This is an inking brush that you can find with Procreate. There's nothing really special about it other than the fact that I have tweaked it slightly just to get a little bit more of a taper at the end. Again, I use this for my inking. That's why I want that taper at the end. But in terms of coloring, it just helps me get a good solid fill when I go to put in the fill on this a little bit later on. Now, I'm going to be like a little bit hasty about this just because I want to kind of do the demonstration here. And we'll go back to the time lapse in a little bit. But the idea here is I want to get this all in the lines as best I can, even into the hair, because I'm going to use all this a little bit later on to help me create masks. All right. So now I kind of got everything mostly filled in. I can just kind of do my fill here and kind of save myself a little bit of time. And then, you know, I can certainly go in and kind of clean this up a little bit later, but for right now, I'm going to call that good enough, all right? Now, what I'm going to do is build a layer, I'm going to alpha lock this layer as well. I am just going to add a layer over top, and then I'm going to turn that into a clipping mask. And now that I have a clipping mask, what I can do is I can color over this in any color that I want, like a lime green, for instance, and notice what happens. It'll never go outside the initial line work that I have, or the initial coloring that I put down underneath of it. So it's using this color layer as a reference as to what to kind of clip out and, you know, offer up the color for. Now I'm going to use this to help me color in my hair. So again, I'm going to get something of a different color in here, and I'm going to kind of just lay it in. But notice now I can kind of go up to the edges here and be a little bit more sloppy about it and not have to worry about it running out. So it makes the whole process just a little bit faster. And let me kind of get the rest of this in here really quick. And we'll move into the next thing. Now, the next thing we need to do here is our eyes. So I'm going to get in something of a white here and just get the eyes in. Same layer, just because I'm doing this quickly, but I might separate this into several different layers, so I kind of felt a desire to. So I got a rough coloring there really quick, and what I can also do if I'm kind of stuck for layers and I need to kind of condense here a little bit, I can combine all this together and notice how it kind of comes together pretty easily. No real impact on what I've done rendering-wise so far. All right, now here's where the trick comes in. Let's start here. I'm going to take a layer all the way up the top here, and I'm going to label this, or name it, my palette layer. I'm going to choose 4 colors for this palette, and they're going to be 2 colors for shadow, 2 colors for light. Now, I'm going to try to avoid long discussions on color theory here, but the idea that I'm going for is cool shadows, warm lights. And I'll do a video a little bit later on to kind of talk about the difference between the two. And if it's possible to flip them, because it is. But for this particular one, I'm going with cool shadows. And when I say cool, I'm going with blues here. So I've got my blue color wheel up here, and I'm going to desaturate it, get into the gray area. And I'm going to take it maybe about a third of the way down. Now notice what this is. This is more gray than blue. It's not really much of a color here, but I'm going to use it as part of my palette. So I'm going to take this and put this on my palette layer, and I'm going to color it in. Now that's a little bit difficult to see. So what I'm going to do here, so I'm going to add just a layer underneath of it, and I want to put in some pure black underneath it, so that way we can have a little bit easier time to see this palette. And let's go ahead and take another shadow, and this one's just going to be darker. I might need to have some darker shadows later, so all I'm going to do is just kind of move down just a little bit more towards the black, and that'll be my darker shadow color. Now I need opposites for lights, so I'm going to make a little palette for my lights, and I'm going to go into this kind of yellow-orange area for this, and I'm going to kind of come up here, very, again, not as desaturated as the blue. I want this to have like some color to it, but I'm going in that gray area there, and that's going to be my one light color. And then for my secondary light color, I'm actually going to put almost white. Not quite there, maybe a little something like that, but I want to get really, really light on this. And this second light is really going to be very rarely used. It's going to be really more for highlights, and I'm going to use those sparingly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select my shadow color, and I'm going to go in and create a layer just for my shadows. So I'm going to put it above my color, but below my line work, so that way it kind of sits in between. I am now going to change that name. I'm going to make it Shadows. And I'm actually going to call this Shadows 1. Sometimes I go in and put a second layer of shadows, depending, but we'll kind of get to that a little bit later. And then I'm going to change to a Multiply Blend mode. Now I use Multiply for all my shadows, and it's the reason why this little color method works so well. This kind of light desaturated blue that I'm using here is going to be all my shadows. But because I'm using it on a blend mode set to multiply, it's going to pull color up underneath of it to help change the color and blend it into something that really kind of passes for a shadow no matter where you put it. So notice how it looks right now. Right now it's just that kind of weird blue color, which is not what I want. I want this, again, on a multiply mode. And when I put it on a multiply mode, notice what happens. It creates something of a shadow color. And that color will change depending where you put it. So notice how it's different when I put it in the hair area. Now that may seem like it's a little sloppy and it doesn't make sense right now, but let's start laying it down in a pattern that makes sense for the face. Remember, we were using that Rembrandt lighting to kind of inspire us here a little bit, so I'm going to put that triangle in right there, okay? And I'm going to take a look at my reference photo and notice there actually quite a bit of his face here is in shadow. So I want to kind of lay it in really thick around here, curve it around the chin a little bit, right? Bring it in here, it comes up under the nose, and we get a little something that looks like this. Now again, this is sloppy. It's done quick. There's also shadow in the hair, right? But you're getting the idea of the method that's used. And with a little bit more precision, a little bit more care, you can start seeing how we get this illusion of 3 dimensions kind of rendered here, okay? Now notice here that I've kind of gone outside the lines. Remember, I don't want that, so what I forgot to do is set this to a clipping mask, and when I set that clipping mask in, notice how it just takes away the parts that I don't need. So let's choose our light color here. We've got it right here, and we're going to create its own layer for it, set it on a clipping mask, and this time my blend mode is going to be for something for light. Now I can use hard light, vivid light, or linear light. It's really just a matter of kind of dialing in whatever your preferred is. Soft light would work too. I tend to kind of focus more on hard light, but I certainly change it up depending on the kind of the mood and the lighting effect that I'm going for. Now I can certainly go in and just kind of use that brush like I did before and kind of get in this light like this. Notice it's a lot less subtle though, so I'm going to back that out and take a little bit of a different approach here. I'm going to actually change to a soft airbrush. Again, the same soft airbrush that's applied with Procreate. There's nothing special about this. But what I am going to do is I'm going to select an area where I want this light to hit. So I'm going to actually use my select tool. If you notice, I got that select tool selected up the top here. And I'm just going to kind of sketch out an area where I want the light to hit. So maybe like around in here, and maybe it's going to kind of come through here a little bit. And I do kind of want it in here and around the chin. And I'll bring it back around through here. Okay, so we've got about half the face here illuminated. I want to turn on that airbrush, and notice how my settings here. I've got it set relatively large size, a very low opacity. I'm going to put this in real gentle like, and I might even take it back a little bit once I kind of get it in a little bit later. So I'm going to kind of really gently just kind of brush it in. I feel like I kind of got something there that I like. I want to take away the selection. And notice I got some hard lines there, but that's okay. I want to turn on my smudge tool here. My smudge tool is also set to a soft airbrush, and I'm just going to kind of blur some of these edges out a little bit. And you can notice how it blends in really nice and starts to create this effect that we got more than one dimension, or rather more than 2 dimensions going on here. Now, that's only part of it, right? We need to do this for some other parts of the face as well, like the nose. Your reference photograph is going to tell you this quite a bit. The nose is going to stick out quite a bit, needs a lot of light source to it. And for this, I am just going to kind use the soft airbrush to a little smaller setting though, so I don't have to necessarily kind of create the select template or the select stencil, so to speak, and just kind of get in a little bit more of that yellow. All right. Now, that's not enough. I'm going to pull out my highlight color, and now I want to go real sparingly in here. I want to kind of hit the bridge of the nose, a little bit on the tip of the nose there. I want to hit the lip, bottom of the lip there a little bit, maybe the tip of the chin, and just a little bit of the edge here and there. And that's about it. Notice in just a couple of easy steps, I've got a really good amount of rendering done. And just like I did with the light layer, I can go back to the shadow layer if I'm not happy with some of the edges here, turn on the smudge tool, and I might like smudge this out around the forehead a little bit, maybe kind of get a little bit fuzzy on the lines of my Rembrandt triangle, kind of fade some of that out a little bit around the nose. And you notice here again, some of this effect kind of gets rendered really nicely. Now, there is one more thing I want to show you here before we go back to the time lapse. It's a really important one with faces, especially with caricatures and portraits, and that's the color red. Right now, we don't have a whole lot of life going on here, and the way that we're going to change that is by going underneath the shadows and the lights, and we're going to add just a little touch of red. So I'm going to go in here, I'm going to pull a nice dark maroon red out. Again, I'm going to use my soft airbrush for this. I want to go slightly larger, but again, low opacity. This is the important part, is that low opacity. And I'm going to come in and kind of paint a little bit of red into the areas where the blood gets close to the skin, like in the nose and the cheeks. So just a little bit in the cheeks, a little bit in the nose, just a little bit of touch here and there. And I am going to also just draw down the size here a little bit. I'm going to get a little bit of red in on the lower lip as well. Not a whole lot, just to give it a little bit of life is really what this is all about. And again, you notice just a couple different steps here, a couple little small little moves, and we've got something that's pretty fairly done in terms of the rendering. Okay, now back into the time lapse here, you can see that we're going to start in the background, get that rendered out really quick, and then come back to the line drawing for the coloring there. Background was relatively simple. It was just a matter of sketching in some loose lines as to where I wanted the wall to go. This is all based off the reference photo, and then using a textured brush set to that multiply, kind of like I did with the shadows, to punch in some little texture, and after that, just a little bit of a blur. I'll be honest with you, that little bit of blur creates all the difference in the world of creating something of that interesting little effect to kind of help it recede in the background there. I'm not entirely done with the background. I'll go back in and lay in some little bit more shadow a little bit later on when I'm ready to kind of finish up with the figure. But for right now, our focus is back to that coloring on the figure. So you notice, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the video, I have everything separated into various layers to help make the coloring and the shading a little bit easier to render. So the head's on its own, torso by itself, each of the arms has its own layer, and then the legs. So you can see how I just basically put in all just the basic flat colors first, and then I'm going to take it piece by piece, layer by layer, to put in the shadows and the light, as I just demonstrated in that kind of a semi-live piece. Up in the upper right-hand corner is the palette that I was referring to before. So on the right-hand side, we have our desaturated grayish blue, then the darker version of that. I didn't really demonstrate it, but we will see in this piece that there are some areas where you're going to want some deeper shadows. And generally speaking, I try to stay away from black. Now, this piece does have some black in it, but it's only in one area. It's black wherever there's line work. If I have a shadow, generally speaking, that shadow is not going to be black. It's going to be dark. It's going to be maybe a dark blue, but it's not really going to be a pure black. And to that effect, I can also tell you that there's never really going to be any instance of pure white either. Even the eyes have a slight tint of blue to them to keep them from just being pure white. Even my highlights have a slight little touch of yellow to them, just because I never really want to kind of go to the extremes on any opposite end of the spectrum. I want to try to stick with realistic colors as much as I can. And there are very, very few instances where pure white or pure black exist in nature. Han's shirt is another example of that. Even in its mid-tone base color, before any shadows are added, that's actually something of a small bluish gray tinge to it. That is not pure white. And as you notice when we get those shadows painted in, how that example of using that multiply blend mode really makes all the difference in the world. I'm using that same light desaturated blue for the white of the shirt, the flesh tones, the hair color, the black that we're going to get into that gun a little bit later on, and it really doesn't matter as long as I've had it set to that multiply mode. You can see now I'm starting to put in some of the yellowish lighting in there for the hand. It looks a little bit too yellow so far, but the additional addition, so to speak, of the whiter highlighting color will help blend everything out and help it make hopefully a little bit more realistic. There is something of a cartoonish feel to how this is done. That's why that line work is going to stay there and not get changed or hidden in any way, shape, or form. So when it comes to these shadows, some of the more harder edges are okay. And sometimes I went in and blended, sometimes I didn't. Again, when you're doing more cartoonish work, you can get away with the harder shadows, or at least, again, the harder edges. If I was doing this in a more photorealistic fashion, I might actually do more of a blend. And when I say blend, let me clarify here a little bit. My observations have led me to believe here that not everything should be a soft edge and not everything should be a hard edge. Depending on where your light source is and how close it is to whatever it is you're illuminating, your shadows are going to react to that. So if the light source is further away, softer edges on your shadows. Get that light source closer, you're going to get a lot more harder edges. Now, our light source in this case is something that I'd use as a reference from the photograph. I'm not entirely sure where it's coming from, but up underneath that palette in the upper right-hand corner, there's a beam of light that's shining and reflecting off the metal that's behind his head. It's kind of a metal tubing, if you will. So that light source is coming from that side, and again, it's off camera. I can't see what it is, but it is something that's lighting up that metal behind him, and so I can assume that the light is going to be on that side of his face as a result. It is relatively far away though, so we are going to be blending we would normally be blending some of those shadows' edges and making them a little bit more soft, again, if I was going for a more photorealistic effect. Since I'm not, I kind of stayed away from it in terms of the face, but you can see I did blend some edges on the hand that's in the foreground there. Again, mostly just because of the fact that it was very, very, very far away from the light source, where the head was a little bit closer. Alright, rendering on the gun, done something in a similar way. I got my dark shadows in there, and that was done by doing 2 layers of shadows. So I used my lighter desaturated blue for one layer, and then because I wanted some deeper, darker, almost black colors, I put in a layer above it, also set that to multiply, but used my darker gray blue for that. The combination of those two, the lighter and the darker gray, actually stack up on top of each other, multiply, and help get me close to black. But again, if you get a color pick it will not be pure black. It's just kind of almost like a darkish blue. So let's finish this thing up with our final punchline here. Just again, reference back to the fact that Han did indeed shoot first if we go back to our original motion picture. I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did, make sure you subscribe. It really helps me out a lot. And don't forget to leave a comment if you have any questions. I'll have more videos soon. Hope to see you again. In the meantime, take care. And good luck to you in your life.